So now we welcome Susan Rodgers, who is Professor Emerita of Anthropology at the College of the Holy Cross, which is in Worcester, Massachusetts. Following fieldwork in Sumatra, she received her PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Chicago in 1978. She taught at Ohio University from 1978 to 1989, when she came to Holy Cross to help establish an anthropology program. She's returned to Indonesia numerous times for field research to explore issues of state power and indigenous arts. She's organized no fewer than 4 Indonesian textile exhibitions for Holy Cross's Iris and B. Gerald Cantor Art Gallery, most recently Transnational ICAT, an Asian textile on the move, in 2013. Among her books are Print, Poetics and Politics, a Sumatran epic in the colonial Indies, and New Order Indonesia of 2005, and with Anne Summerfield and John Summerfield, Gold Cloths of Sumatra, Indonesia's Songkets from Ceremony to Commodity of 2007, which accompanied an exhibition at the Cantor Gallery. Today, she's going to talk to us about headhunting cloths, query, power and interpretation in Iban and Dayak textiles on the move. Please welcome Susan Rodgers.
Thank you, and we'll keep the lights up until I show you some installation photographs from an even more recent exhibition than Transnational ICAT. That is the one I'm going to let you into some of the secrets about. An exhibition called Woven Power about Iban and Dayak textiles that the Cantor Gallery hosted in fall of 2016. I think this talk will work productively with Ruth Barnes' talk. Hand-woven Indonesian textiles from throughout the archipelago are replete with power dynamics. One might even say that the power dynamics of social hierarchy are woven into many of them. In their design fields, their dye work, their patterns of gift exchange and trade, and in their use in ritual and costume. With Toba Batak Ulos cloaks and baby slings, for instance, the ritually superior, ritually holier, more holy, wife-giver house, that is in Toba the Hula Hula, bestows such a blessing cloth on their ritually beholden, socially subservient wife receivers, their anak boru. This occurs especially at weddings and in the celebration of a baby's birth. The wife-giver's ulos cloth gift to their daughter and her new husband is said to convey to them health, prosperity, magic luck powers, and a continued flow of fertility from high in the marriage system hierarchy to low in such arrangements, which touch on both everyday life and cosmic order. A blessing cloth, such as a Toba Ulos cloth, mystically helps the newlyweds to produce an even greater gift, a newborn. Those subservient, lower status Anak-Boro wife receivers will have their own bride receivers of their own as they go through time, as their own daughters marry down the ritual hierarchy. The Anak-Boro, now turned hula hula, wife givers, concretize their social and spiritual place in the world and cosmos by giving a special blessing textile down the hierarchy to their daughters and their new households. Bride wealth payments, often cash or metal goods or livestock, course back in the other direction to give even more material, experiential form to the supernatural and to the everyday real-world partnership among the marriage system houses. As much textile scholarship about Indonesia has shown, these sorts of power relations are often found in societies that have asymmetrical marriage alliance. In some societies outside Java and Bali, by no means all, but in some societies outside Java and Bali, flows of textiles as gifts and folk ideologies of natural dye making and ikat motif registers often emblemize the workings of the local marriage system for weavers, for gift presenters, for gift receivers, and for the wearers of these lovely cloths. Indonesian textiles in even more hierarchical and wealthier societies than the Toba Batak often also provide physical, seeable, touchable, and wearable objects for materializing social inequality, particularly in cloth. For instance, in Minangkabau villages and towns in 19th century through 1930s West Sumatra, Luxurious silk and gold thread cloths called songket worked as status display items for well-off local elites who were both, sometimes they were traditional aristocrats and sometimes they were wealthy merchant families who had gained riches in trading imported cloth yard goods from Europe, or they had made a bundle of money through trading coffee. These systems of extreme wealth enmeshed Minangkabau elites within the commercial enterprises and government bureaucracies of the Dutch colonial state. That state simultaneously extracted resources such as coal and crops from West Sumatra and promoted visions of the Minangkabau as a so-called traditional people with exotic-looking houses, cute pony carts, and colorful costumes with songket textiles fashioned into buffalo horn-shaped headdresses. Many other state-level societies in colonial-era Indonesia had similar repertoires of gorgeous-looking high-status cloths made with supplementary weft gold threads, paired with similar entanglements at the institutional level with colonial power centers, with markets, and with bureaucracies. By the mid to late 1800s, not too surprisingly, both the hand-loomed, often ikat cotton cloths associated with asymmetrical marriage alliance and the frame-loomed songkets with their shiny gold and silvery wrapped supplementary wefts caught the eye of European collectors of exotic art. This situation had many power dynamics to it, too, ones that counterpose metropole wealth and status and claims to high civilization and good taste in art with an imagined village primitiveness, so-called, and also very much a real-world village poverty. In this sometimes pernicious sort of transnational exchange, great textiles flowed out of the Indonesian house treasuries when local regions experienced economic downturns, or more recently, when once wealthy families became cash poor and found themselves in need of university tuition money to send grandchildren to college in big cities. The university diploma is the new status textile in Indonesia. Sometimes unfortunate power dynamics also characterize the museum-based collecting of Indonesian ritual textiles. By the late 1800s, colonial museums in Jakarta and ones in international capitals in Europe had entered into a power-laden trade in intricately designed, beautiful ceremonial cloths for their permanent collections and for public display in museum galleries. In these earlier decades, international art collectors of so-called primitive art were often not able or not willing to categorize Indonesian handloom textiles with much sociological or historical accuracy. And these collectors valued their textile acquisitions in terms of the cloth's complex and intriguing motif registers, which some collectors interpreted as harking back to ancient myths. Collectors were also often acutely attuned to issues of weaving excellence. Both collectors and museums in the colonial capitals and in Indies hinterlands and in Western Europe, despite what were often much more moderate intentions, frequently got caught up in ideological efforts to scientifically, quote unquote, classify Indonesia's dozens of ethnic societies and their village arts. Imagine schemes of lower and higher forms of civilization and corresponding realms of art and craft work resulted. Unfortunately, museum visions of the colonial Indies as a congeries of craft-producing traditionalist village societies following autochthonous religions effectively blocked from the museum goer's view the importance of the Indonesian anti-colonialist nationalist movements of the 1920s and 30s. The centrality of Islam to many Indonesian worldviews was also largely silent in some of these older museum practices. Also blocked from view in colonial Indies residents' intense interest in being modern, certainly by the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. My paper today, though, concerns yet another dimension of power and contestation and Indonesian and Malaysian handloom textiles. My paper also deals with museum representations, but with contemporary textile collectors, a gentleman named John Crayfield, and with anthropologists, myself. This paper is a case study of my own somewhat painful but ultimately reasonably happy experiences in guest curating an exhibition at the College of the Holy Cross for the campus's Iris and Gerald B. Cantor Gallery. The show was entitled Woven Power, Ritual Textiles of Sarawak and West Kalimantan, and the cloths had been woven on backstrap looms by Iban and Dayak weaver women and master dyers. On display for the 15 weeks of the fall semester 2016 were over 60 remarkably beautiful, mostly old warp ikats, each one positively ablaze with patterns. The motifs range from geometrics to animal spirit figures to humanoid and demon figures to palm trees draped with head trophies from memories of head taking, to forest scenes of fireflies blinking on and off in synchronization. These textiles had been woven from the early 1800s through the 1930s by Iban women in longhouses in Sarawak and by Dayak women in what is now called West Kalimantan. These ethnic categories are very fungible, actually, so I'm artificially calling them Iban and Dayak. Also, the geographical terms are somewhat anachronistic, but I'll use West Kalimantan, the Indonesian provincial term, and Sarawak, the Malaysian state term here. Sarawak is now a state in East Malaysia, and West Kalimantan is a province in Indonesia. Both are located on the large island, sometimes called Borneo. A few pieces on display in our Woven Power show were from the 1950s and 1960s. We also presented a handful of very contemporary, small-scale textiles woven in craft workshops affiliated with craft cooperatives in Sintang, which is an administrative town in West Kalimantan, and in Kuching, the state capital of Sarawak. These several contemporary cloths, sponsored by the Kobus Foundation in Sintang, a Catholic organization for the preservation of indigenous arts, and the Tunjuga Foundation in Kuching, were woven as part of these enterprises' efforts to conserve old Dayak and Iban weaving traditions and to pass them on to new generations of nearby residents. But these Kobus and Tunjuga textiles were a very small part of the exhibition. I was lucky enough to visit Kuching multiple times over 4 years to interview weavers, art dealers, heritage craft sellers, and expert Iban staff at the Tunjuga Foundation. 2 of these trips involved Holy Cross undergraduates who later became our exhibition docents. We did library research as well as at the Tunjuga Foundation in Kuching. This is an organization, a foundation established by a prominent Iban business and political family in honor of their patriarch. In 2015, I traveled to Sintang with Kuching area museum professionals. There we visited the remarkable provincial museum, which is consulted extensively with the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. And we also interviewed weavers and brokers in a longhouse that was quite close to Sintang. Over the 3 years prior to the exhibition's opening, I also read the often remarkably argumentative scholarly literature about Iban ritual textiles. Different scholars have markedly different interpretive frameworks for dealing with these cloths, ranging from art historical approaches to a few based on ethnography to, in one odd development, frameworks that based on sociobiological explanations of women's weaving expertise. Before working on Woven Power as a guest curator, as a Holy Cross faculty member in anthropology and Asian studies and also women, gender, and sexuality studies, I had guest curated a number of earlier exhibitions of Indonesian and Malaysian special cloths for our Cantor Art Gallery. In most of these earlier exhibitions, such as 2013's Transnational Ikat, an Asian textile on the move, I felt that as the guest curator, I had a strong voice in designing the exhibition, in writing the wall panels and labels with my student docents, and in setting the exhibition's main themes. In Transnational Ikat, for instance, student docents Tricia Giglio, Hannah Carey, and Martha Walters and I highlighted the ways that international circuits of exchange for exotic local cloths had interacted with Sumatran and East Balinese and Eastern Indonesian ikat weaving communities to produce quite new and eminently marketable Indonesian heritage textiles on sale in shops in Bali and Jakarta and online for use in low-end but also high-end fashion wear and in home decoration such as decorative pillowcases and seat covers, not to mention e-cotted wine caddies. In other words, our exhibition, Transnational E-Cot, the 2013 one, was imbued with the truth claims and even an aesthetic straight out of current-day economic anthropology classes, post-colonial studies, and publications such as Walter Little and Patricia McEnany's excellent essay collection, Textile Economies, Power and Value from the Local to the Transnational. Not so the case with Woven Power in 2016, and it's mostly antique Iban and Dayak pua, or big blankets, and kain kabat, or ceremonial skirts. As the guest curator, in fact, and as an anthropologist steeped in such literature as Textile Economies, I felt a bit shunted off to the side. The power dynamic then in this 2016 show was between me as a historically minded anthropologist teaching critical museum studies courses such as Holy Cross's Art and Power in Asia, and on the other side, a major textile collector, Dr. John Crayfield, who lent most of the older cloths to our exhibition. John's generosity in loaning Cantor Gallery these spectacular cloths, of course, made Woven Power possible, incontrovertibly. Cantor owns only 4 pua of our own, gifts of the late textile researchers Anne and John Summerfield. To no one's surprise, John Crayfield sought to have his vision of his very excellent collection of Borneo ritual textiles clearly manifest in the Woven Power show and in its assorted publications, lectures, wall panel texts, and the labels for individual weavings. But I wanted to say too, as curator, and therein lay some exciting times for Cantor Art Gallery. John Crayfield has been retired for some years from a long career on the faculty at Tufts University in engineering and design. Since the 1990s, with the collaboration of several internationally prominent art dealers in Indonesian textiles and Malaysian textiles and sculptures, these dealers are located in California, Bali, and Kuching. John has systematically collected excellent examples of most of the major types of Iban Pua Kumbu blankets and ceremonial hangings. He also has a passionate interest in collecting superb pua and ritual skirts made by Dayak women in West Kalimantan. This geographic domain of Borneo textile collecting is just now catching on with prominent collectors, and John wanted to make sure that he could further show a spotlight on West Kalimantan. John also has a devotion to collecting expertly designed kain kabat ritual skirts from diverse Iban and Dayak home regions. He feels that the skirts have been unfairly neglected in favor of the bigger and more immediately stunning pua cloths. John has a world-class, comprehensive, representative collection amassed clearly as a work of love. And Cantor Art Gallery director Roger Hankins and I indeed were hard-pressed to narrow down our and John's selection of the 60 cloths for the exhibition from among the many, many more in Crayfield's extensive collection. John also publishes in specialist journals about the textiles in his collection and about Ebonic textile art in general. John Crayfield and I were of two minds, shall I put it, in thinking about how best to represent Ebonic and Dayak weaving and dyeing excellence in Woven Power. Like many major internationally prominent Indonesian and Malaysian area textile collectors, John Crayfield forefronts technical weaving excellence and high dye work quality when selecting which cloths to purchase from dealers. I would have been absolutely fine with that. I very much admire that an eye for those qualities. But he also is fascinated with what he sees as strong connections between old Iban and Dayak creation myths and culture hero myths and the actual motifs ecotted into the cloth. That is, motifs such as first weaver woman, first warrior man, crocodile, leech, creator serpent, and so on. But it was images of ritual trees hung with trophy heads on the cloth from purported headhunting raids in the past, and images of taken heads per se and the very special textiles connected specifically to head reception back in the longhouses that commanded much of John's attention and also his scholarly focus in his several journal articles. Iban men venturing into the forest to fight with enemies and cut off their heads. The image of the trophy heads being taken back to the longhouse to be presented formally to the warriors' wives. The idea that head taking was closely associated with ideas of human fertility and sexuality. the imagined connections between taken heads and human babies, both to be swaddled in ritual cloths. These tropes were foundational to Iban ritual weaving, in John's view. This contention follows a long line of textile scholarship about Sarawak, tracing back to Alfred Haddon and Laura Start's classic 1936 monograph, Iban or Sea Dayak fabrics and their patterns. As an anthropologist, I saw things quite differently. Perhaps in part this was because I'm not a Borneo specialist at all. I study textiles in Sumatra for the most part, and look at art and also print narrative, such as novels in indigenous languages, such as Angkola Batak, in the political context of minority society to state power relationships, both in the colonial Indies days and in national era Indonesia. As an avid reader of the anthropological scholarship on Southeast Asian head-taking as political metaphor, for instance, Ken George's Showing Signs of Violence, the Cultural Politics of a 20th Century Headhunting Ritual, and Janet Hoskin's anthology, Head-Taking in the Social Imagination in Southeast Asia, I questioned the truth claims of Iban's stories about head-taking exploits from the past. I also knew that contemporary Iban scholars of art and textiles, such as Janet Ratha-Noel, who is a museum curator at the Tunjuga Foundation at Kuching, and she's also an Iban weaver, those scholars, Iban scholars, sometimes looked askance at Western collectors and art dealers' fervent attraction to the headhunting aspects of the pua cloths as the supposed foundational basis of this weaving tradition. Some of the Iban myths said that longhouse residents once thought that human pregnancy and the growth of the rice in the fields and peace in the longhouse all came from the regular replenishment of the house's supply of enemy heads, whose acquisition also aided the community in bringing a period of mourning to a close. That last contention makes a good deal of comparative sense to me, but like Janet Ratha-Noel, the Iban scholar, I asked exactly who in these communities believed these head-taking fertility stories. Was it everyone or just a few? Were the tales perhaps narratives bandied about by outsiders for political effect? Had the myths been significantly altered during their collection by foreign ethnographers? What was the sociology of knowledge at work here in these anything but simple myths about cloth, death, birth, and regeneration? Janet is now completing a PhD in anthropology at the University of Malaya and has done fieldwork in Iban longhouses with contemporary weavers who come from long lines of weavers and dyers. So that's going to be a very important work, I think, when she finishes it and publishes it. John Crayfeld's tendency to look directly at Iban myths circa about 1900 to interpret the textiles' meanings, quote unquote, struck me as ahistorical in the sense that these textiles were woven at a time of widespread Iban conversion to Christianity, and at a time when some master weavers in Sarawak seem to have been adjusting and tweaking their motif repertoires to attract the eye and perhaps the pocketbooks of the wives of Brooks-era colonial administrators stationed in trading entrepôts such as Kuching. Members of the James Brooke family were the so-called White Rodgers of Sarawak. They had established a lucrative personal kingdom in this part of Borneo, in part through KG alliances with Iban chiefdoms. Iban textile production fell into this political and economic maelstrom in exactly the time when the textiles in John's collection were being produced. The motifs of many of these 1800s to 1920s and 1930s Iban ritual textiles seem to me to index colonial era power relations between longhouse dyers and weaver women, small-scale collectors, and the colonial administration and its forced expansion of a money economy into the upriver regions. The famous colonial era Sarawak Museum was also part of this mix. It was beginning to amass a major textile collection of sweeping scope by the end of the Brooks era. I suspected that headhunting tropes in some of the pua textiles may have been at least in part artifacts of Iban weavers and dyers' ability to create cloths for markets of European collectors and museum administrators. Head-taking is undeniably gory, frightening, and alluring to some Orientalist collectors. Somehow the collector, John Crayfeld, who was also very much a textile scholar, and the anthropologist, me, managed not to kill each other in designing and writing about and talking about this 2016 exhibition at Holy Cross. We both managed, I think, to work in this way because Roger Hankins, our gallery director, was such a peacekeeper. The compromises we made, I think, though, are worth recalling in some detail here. We did come to, John and I did come to some quite productive points of détente. It seems to me that anthropology and museum studies need more fine-grained examinations of the power dynamics and skirmishes going on in actual textile exhibitions like this one, which do span disciplinary gulfs. By the end of this whole experience with woven power, I had decided that a strong exhibition need not speak in one voice. That some noise in the system of texts and photographs and object labels can actually be a good thing, especially for museum visitors. I'll detail some of our compromises here, since I'm able to think about them now from a distance of 1.5 years. Let me start by showing you some installation photos, and here if we could put maybe the lights down a bit. Thank you. So that we can see the look of the show. We did operate under a number of constraints at Cantor Gallery in designing woven power. Paramount among these was the fact that Cantor Art Gallery is explicitly an art museum. It's not an anthropological, ethnological museum. Cantor's mission statement governs this, and although Gallery Director Roger Hankins has always welcomed my guest curatorships as an anthropologist, the museum does explicitly display art in aestheticized context. Great textile art from Borneo fit the bill well, although in all my previous exhibitions I've had, let's say, a lot of space to anthropologize things. First of all, as you can see here, this is when you come into Cantor Art Gallery. It's a large, big room. We really forefronted, all of us, Roger, John, and myself, the sheer loveliness of the textiles. And Roger himself has quite an eye for the importance of color and painting the walls in Cantor Gallery space. So he very much sees installing a show as creating a work of art. So we have the textile art itself, and then we have the gallery space as a lovely space. And he has always succeeded well with this. Obviously, red and dark orange are our main colors here. John's collection was absolutely overwhelming in its size and high quality, and we did want to show a number of cloths. We ended up showing, as I said, about 60, and that meant that there was not much room for anthropological wall texts, or indeed for contemporary pua weavings. So these big antique pieces really dominated things. This is shot from where you would come into the gallery, and right at the beginning, over to the left-hand side, we would have a continuous video loop of videos that my student docents and I took in Kuching, in Longhouses, and most especially at the weaving studio at Tunjuga. So that was kind of going on over here, and then some of those smaller heritage textile pieces were over to the right-hand side. And John wasn't upset by that at all. That was fine. But most of the gallery space was dominated by these absolutely huge textiles. So that did not leave much room for wall text. John's collection, as I said, wait a minute. Okay, color of the walls. Let me see if I can show you the slant boards. That's just more of the, here. Many of John's best pieces, he told us, and we agree, were the ceremonial skirts, the khan kabat, and we wanted to have some way of displaying them where people could get up close and look at the details. John was not very fond of the idea of putting them onto mannequins. We actually own a number of mannequins, but we only got away, Roger and I, with using one mannequin, so most of the khan kabat are on these triangular boards. At first I was worried about that because I do like a textile to be shown as it's worn, but part of John's rationale for that is that this displayed them as seeable pieces of art where the student groups, and we had numerous classes coming in, could get close to the piece and look at, not surprisingly, the motifs and the design field. So we had a number of the skirts displayed in this way. There are more of them. We always like to have kind of a march of textiles over on that side, so we retain that. There it is. Yeah, it's quite dramatic, and these pieces are just overwhelmingly beautiful. It was just a gorgeous, gorgeous show. Anyone who came in always said that. Now, we had a video loop up front, and then one, I'll start with the compromises. This was a wonderful one. This was the intro text panel, and it was a picture of an actual weaver who John had found out her name, and he knew some of her family history, and we all agreed that it was a wonderful idea to put a named weaver on display right up front and to give some of her concrete biography. Okay, let me go on to some more compromises here. I'll say two visions of Pua compromises in woven power rhetorics. Let me do this fairly informally. Let me see. First of all, the publications. This is going to make a lot of you laugh, I bet. Early on, Roger and I thought that the exhibition would have one catalog, right? That's what you normally have. And that I, as the curator, would write the catalog. And as Roger and I got further and further into our deliberations and conversations with John Crayfield, it became so clear to Roger and me that John really wanted to have explanations of the meanings of the motifs. And he wanted a whole lot of concrete detail about that for each textile here. And I went to Roger one time in a car trip that we were taking to John's house in the Boston area. And I said, I just cannot do that. I can't write that sort of thing convincingly. It's not me, and I don't have that kind of expertise. And I certainly can't talk about headhunting tropes in that way. So we decided to write two books, and that's what we did. And they'll be both published this coming late spring. John wrote a wonderful classic catalog. So he has we have a picture of each textile in the exhibition. Next to it, a dense full page of text, letting him go on about the motifs, but in a very useful way, detail as much of the history of the concrete textile. And so that's one publication. And then I wrote a book which is a series of 3 anthropological essays that is called Stunned by Beauty, Ritual Textiles from Sarawak and West Kalimantan. And it is somewhat different. My publication is a set of 3 interlocked anthropological essays reviewing the history of the interpretation debates and battles about Iban textiles, and then going on to argue that Malay literature scholar Hank Meyer's point that the wider Malay world can be seen as an interlocked flow or field of interpenetrating languages and art worlds can be very useful for the study of Iban textile and Dayak ritual textiles. I then went on in this series of essays to conclude with a chapter drawn from my own fieldwork on the contemporary transformation of Pua weaving into heritage art, mostly in Sarawak, set in the context of national level debates in Malaysia and Indonesia about the purported proper place of minority peoples such as the Iban and the Dayak within their respective nations. I looked at such things as a contemporary necklace made just in the last couple of years by a Kuching-based artist named Ramsey Ong. This is a piece composed of old-looking beads and then beads covered with remnants of actual old Pua cloth made into heritage art fashion jewelry for sale in the main museum's trendy coffee shop gift store on Grand Bazaar Street in Kuching. I also examined a book sponsored by the Kobus Foundation of Sentep, West Kalimantan. That's the Catholic foundation, which is a poverty alleviation foundation. Anyway, the book was entitled, it's in Bahasa Indonesia, in Indonesian. It's entitled Tenun Ikat Dayak Desa, Cerita dan Motif Kain. The ikat textiles, the ikat weavings of the village Dayak people, stories and motifs of the cloth. The entries in this fascinating book were edited by Pastor Jacques Massain, a Dutch Catholic priest long resident in the city of Sintang. He interviewed weaver women and recorded their interpretations of their own cloth motifs and meanings. Remarkably, the exegesis holds that the motifs are really talking about how to be a good and well-behaved citizen of contemporary Indonesia, in accord with good Pancasila virtues. That's the 5-part Indonesian national motto, the national ideology. These two books, John's and mine, admittedly talk past each other. But I, for one, one, had no interest in censoring views different from my own in this very complex and multivocal exhibition. Roger plans to sell the 2 books as a set, and John and I hope that they will be reviewed together. And the thing that made this possible is we had a very generous alum donor, Mr. Michael Figge, who gave us a wonderful subsidy so we could come up with 2 books. Secondly, we did some interesting things, shall I say, with the written text that appeared in the exhibition itself. This show, like many others, had labels for the individual textiles. Let me see if I can find a shot of it there. Those are the labels down there. Had labels for the individual textiles, but also longer thematic wall text, which would be like that. Which also included, which always included fieldwork photos from my own and our student docents' trip to Sarawak. In my previous Cantor Art Gallery exhibitions, the labels, even when I co-authored them with textile researchers Anne and John Summerfield for our Gold Cloths of Sumatra show, were fairly short. For woven power, though, these labels grew in size, and we asked John Crayfield to write those, which he was very pleased to do. Here's one typical one with his initials at the bottom, so everyone would know who wrote it. I'll just read a paragraph of this. Puakumbu, circa late 19th to early 20th century, Sariban River area, more broadly, the 2nd Division, and then some technical details. This textile, John writes, displays what looks like the aftermath of a surreal and horrific battlefield. There are 18 or 19 ranks of heads and bodies, some whole, some broken, some jointed at the hips, detached heads and limbs, crocodiles with human heads and gaping mouths. The meaning behind the imagery of a human-headed crocodile may be found in understanding that to the Iban, the head was the repository of the spirit, which is why it was taken when the body was left behind. The crocodile, the Baya, has multiple associations. As a mere crocodile, it can be dangerous to the Iban, but as an underwater deity, men see it as the tutelary spirit, a sort of guardian angel in battle. Weavers who wanted to honor their menfolk spirit with the familiar akibaya, grandfather crocodile, often portrayed it on cloth. And then the caption goes on to say that's what the weaver was intending to portray, unquote. The vividness of the headhunting imagery here is obvious. This one, like all the labels in the show, was signed with John's initials. My initials, by contrast, would appear at the base of the thematic wall text. And those texts took a quite different perspective than John's focus on motifs, direct ties to myth, and danger and violence. My several wall panels included ones. One title was Textiles Today, Making and Using Heritage Textiles in Modern Indonesia and Malaysia, and that forefronted dye work and the importance of dye excellence. And I also had one called On Women's Textile Creativity, Ceremonial Skirts, and a final one that I think really got right to the point, Stunned by Beauty and Iban Aesthetic. There I was drawing on the beautiful Timang chants, which are death chants, and was able to quote verse in that wall text and introduce the idea that I think a core Iban aesthetic of the world is you look in the tropical forest and you see absolutely stunning beauty. You look at animals of the tropical forest, you see stunning beauty. You look at textiles and you see stunning beauty. So I wanted to kind of counter the imagery of violence with the imagery of being taken aback by the beauty of the world. Overall, I was trying to introduce the museum visitors to Iban aesthetics beyond head-taking violence. And I have more details here. Just 2 more quick points. We also, my docents and I, very much forefronted gallery walkthroughs. And you can do whatever you want in gallery walkthroughs. So the students and I had been to Sarawak together. They had taken textile and dye work lessons in Bali at Threads of Life in Ubud. And so one of my students, Melissa Graham, would kind of specialize in one of these textiles over here, which very much does talk about headhunting. And she would point out the motifs, and she was very appreciative of John's detail. But she would also kind of do an Edward Said Orientalism take on the different generations of interpretations. And that seemed to catch the attention of the Holy Cross students in the classes. And another thing that we would really take a point to do is to have certain fieldwork photos that we would deconstruct. There's one that I took actually on a trip that the docents and I took to the really hilarious Sarawak Cultural Village outside of Kuching. It's kind of like Disneyland. Learn everything about Sarawak in half a day of tours. And I took a picture of a very traditional looking Iban weaver woman. And people who were just casually in the exhibition and would see that, they said, oh, this is a traditional weaver. Well, no, we would allow them to see it was in a Disneyland mocked up set. So to conclude, I think what I learned from the whole experience is that we have to respect our audience, and we have to help them see some of the nuances of this. I know from many years of teaching art and power in Asia, where I would use Sally Price's book, Primitive Art in Civilized Places, that when students read a book like that, and they read the chapter on international art collectors, they tend to think about art collecting in very negative ways. And one thing we wanted students to get out of the show is not only that there are different ways of interpreting motifs, particularly in Iban textiles, but we wanted them to understand that, first of all, the only reason they can see the show is because John Crayfield had put together this wonderful collection. Then we would often end on the fact that at the Tunjuga Museum in Kuching, the collection there was amassed by Datin Amar Margaret Lingi, who is from an elite Iban family, and she was a very self-conscious collector and gave her collection as a study collection to the Kuching, to the Tunjuga Foundation. So we wanted our visitors to question everything. And what I've come away with is that it actually is a good thing to have noise in an exhibition. And you do have to trust your visitors to be able to see this with some subtlety. And it was just a wonderful emotional and aesthetic experience to see these wonderful cloths. So thank you.
Well, I think it's really very important that we get an insight into how things don't always go quite as one might expect in a museum, and that there is room for more than one point of view with any body of material.